Good evening, everyone. Time for another silver update. This is the 8-hour chart of silver provided by netdania.com. You can click on the link below. Now, I'm comparing a couple of trend lines here. We did get a smackdown today that took us down below the trend line, but you can see that we're clearly beginning to fight this trend line. I think this area here is going to ultimately mark an area somewhat similar to this area over here. You can see, and we could actually draw a couple of more than one trend line here, just as we have one down below here. So I'm thinking that we're probably doing something similar to what we did back in here, where these trend lines are clearly valid. The top one was met right there by that spike, but you can see there's another one down below here. As soon as we got through it, we started to consolidate, and eventually it ended up in a breakthrough of all of them. I think that's the process that we're doing right here. Certainly, there can't be much more downside as far as fundamentally. Technically, obviously, there can be, but fundamentally for them to suppress the price down below the cost of mining, keep it there, still have shortages with Silver Eagles, it kind of gets to the point of absurdity and ridiculousness, and they're going to have to let it go, let it snap back. So I think that if we measure it on a relative scale, probably something similar to what happened here when we had the snapback back to the major downtrend line, then we may be looking at a snapback probably up to this area in here, and that's going to be $30 or so, would be an equivalent snapback rally to ultimately a long-term trend line, but we'll have to pull all the way out to see that. So again, we're looking at $30 or so, and it just depends on how you draw the lines. So we'll just draw them on the long-term chart here, something like this. So a correction back up to $30. It's going to take us through the $26 price. If we get something similar to the snapback rally that we had here, then obviously that's going to be the end of this long-term downtrend, and we're back in an uptrend, because you can see that this topping point that we had in 2008 that marked the Bear Stearns collapse, and we know that in the spring of 2008 that's when the financial crisis accelerated. So we know that this marked the beginning of the financial crisis. Pretty much was the top in silver. It was the funds, Bear Stearns, that went under, and then Bear Stearns went under, and then it just cascaded from there. So I expect a snapback rally to through the 26 and up to 30. Probably will surprise us in its rapidity. Can't say that it's coming immediately, but it appears that it's coming fairly soon, and that will be a fairly strong rally when it comes. So I want to look at these global vampires, I'll call them, that we call the IMF, and there's the World Bank and all the rest of these guys. And I want to have you watch this video, which is somewhat shocking. The reason why I'm going to go over this video is because there's some hints at a potential reset that we may be looking at. And of course, we're always trying to read the tea leaves to see what these global vampires and psychopaths, I'll call them, are doing. Before we do that, let's take a look at a couple articles over on Zero Hedge. First, I want you to recognize that these global vampires and psychopaths, they're completely incompetent. The only legend that they are is in their own minds, because they're always wrong. And they don't know what they're doing. They're incompetent buffoons, but they have their New Age type of religion, and we'll see that with the numerology that Dame Christine Lagarde goes into, who's the newest rising star in this witch's brew of these vampires who are destroying the world. But you can see here the comedy of errors with IMF forecasting. You couldn't do a worse job of forecasting. That doesn't slow them down, of course. We're going to see with Ms. Lagarde that they're going to be right there, just as adamant about their forecasts now as they were in the past. Never, of course, never admitting that their forecasts are pathetic, that a monkey throwing darts could make better forecasts than these people do. You can see here, but perhaps the most notable feature of today's set of numbers is the IMF's forecast of world trade. In a word, it is crashing. Consider that 2013 world trade was expected to grow by 5.6% in April 2012. Now it is more than 50% lower at just 2.7%. And you can see on the charts here, they were wrong, as wrong as you could be. So wrong that, like I said, a monkey throwing darts could do a better job than they do. So go ahead and read that. Zero Hedge has covered this for a long time. They're always wrong. And of course we know that these people don't know anything. Not only do they don't know anything about economics, but they don't even know anything about what their central planning is going to result in. And there couldn't be a better example of that than this article on Zero Hedge as well today about Europe and the EU and the disaster, utter disaster. Now we know it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out the fact that if you take a whole bunch of different countries and mash them together into one great big union and don't allow them to have separate interest rate and currency mechanisms. In other words, if you combine part of the things but don't combine the rest, or if you don't leave them to have their own currency to make adjustments, then obviously it's going to result in a disaster because they're going to be pegged together. And so now we see here that we have an admission on what's going to be required, and of course we already know what's going to be required with the financial repression that they've already forced down. But here's an admission here. Today, the unthinkable finally happened when the following stunner was released by Laszlo Andor of the European Commission in a press release discussing the Employment and Social Development's annual review highlights need to address risks of in-work poverty. Now, we know we've been talking about the EU for a while. The unemployment rate is just ridiculously high, especially among the youth there. So these central planner world economic global vampires who are destroying, who have already destroyed Europe, pretty much have destroyed the nations of Europe, they have the same plans for the rest of the world. And she'll mention Abe in Japan. But so here's the admission. So there you have it, not from some fringe blog or some radical foaming in the mouth Eurosceptic, but from the bastion of that most artificial construct of modern times itself, a united Europa. And they're admitting that the only way that they're going to get some kind of adjustment that's needed in Europe is this admission here. The bulk of European countries will need to see wage collapse by anywhere between 30 and 50% to compensate for the lack of state-level currency devaluation optionality. And yes, this includes France. So, no better spokesperson for the disaster that is France than Christine Lagarde. So, we're going to play Christine at the IMF Global Economy Summit, January 15th. I'll try to take this apart a little bit. Note, when we first begin, note all the references to their Illuminati witchcraft numerology, which they probably do a better job of forecasting things if they stuck to their numerology.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for having me with you. I would like to thank the National Press Club and especially President Angela Grilling-Keane.
They always have to thank the National Press Club because those are the only people in the audience, are the sycophants of the global press who suck up to their world witchcraft that any honest person knows is a complete failure.
For not only inviting me to this prestigious venue, but essentially presenting the outline of what I want to talk to you about now. So it's as if we had prepared that together, which we have not. Now let me first of all, of course, begin by wishing you all a Happy New Year. I guess it's still time to do that, given that we are just exactly halfway through between our Western New Year and the Lunar New Year, which will loom in a few weeks' time. I think it's also appropriate to wish ourselves a Happy New Year, given what I would like to talk to you about, which has to do with the global economy and what we should expect for 2014. Now I'm going to test you numerology skills by asking you to think about the magic 7. Okay?
Seriously? You've got to be kidding me. We're going to be talking about magic. Well, actually, that makes sense because magic would probably be more accurate than the forecasts they've done so far. So maybe if they throw in a Eye of Newt and some toads and stir it up in their witch's brew, they might come up with a more accurate forecast than they've been doing.
Most of you will know that 7 is quite a number in all sorts of themes, religions, and I'm sure that you can compress numbers as well. So, if we think about 2014, all right, I'm just giving you 2014, you drop the 0, 14, 2 times 7. Okay, that's just by way of example, and we're going to carry on.
So, we're giving you a little hint here that something big's going to happen in 2014.
So 2014 will be a milestone and hopefully a magic year in many respects. It will mark the 100th anniversary of the First World War back in 1914. It will mark the 70th anniversary, drop the 0, 7, of the Bretton Woods Conference that actually gave birth to the IMF. And it will be the 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. 25th.
If you miss that, you have to add the 2 and the 5 together to get the 7.
It will also mark the 7th anniversary of the financial market jitters that quickly turned into the greatest global economic calamity since the Great Depression.
Jitters. Jitters, I guess she meant to say. Oh, by the way, Christine, did the IMF predict that? Oh, that's right, they didn't.
The crisis still lingers. Yet, optimism is in the air. We've left the deep freeze behind us, and the horizon looks just a bit brighter. So my hope and my wish for 2014 is that after those 7 miserable years, weak and fragile, we have 7 strong years.
Oh, so let's take the biblical example of the 7 lean years and then the 7 years of plenty and turn it on its head. Of course, we knew beforehand both sets of 7, and they were allowed to prepare for the lean years by the 7 years of plenty. But of course, now we're being told that we've already had the 7 lean years, and the IMF is going to lead us through 7 plenteous years that they didn't tell us beforehand.
I don't know whether the G7 will have anything to do with it, or whether it will be the G20. I certainly hope that the IMF will have something to do with it.
Oh, I'm sure they will. They've had their hands in every disaster so far.
Now, is this wishful thinking? No. But it will not happen randomly without us together, and policymakers in particular, making the right decisions.
Like you've made so far? Like the financial disaster that you've created so far with your zero interest rate policies and the unemployment and fracturing of European economies. Yeah.
Having the right policy mix, organizing themselves in a coordinated way. Let me talk about, first of all, the global outlook as we see it, and then I would like to touch on the policies that I believe will help us transform those 7 miserable years into 7 strong years. Now, I'm going to anticipate on potential questions that some of you might be tempted to ask by just stating clearly that I'm not going to give you the number of our revised World Economic Outlook number that will be disclosed on January 21st.
The one that we just covered that was wrong by 50%.
Suffice to say that it will be directionally positive as a revision. But I'm going to discuss the main trends, but not the numbers. We saw the momentum strengthen in the latter half of 2013, and we believe that it will continue to strengthen in 2014.
The momentum of what? The momentum of the rich getting richer?
Largely due to improvement in the advanced economies. Yet, despite that, and that directionally positive movement, growth is still stuck in fairly low gear. It remains below potential, which we believe is at around 4%, which means that the world could, if it worked at full potential, could create a lot more jobs than before, than we do have at the moment, and we could do that without having to worry about the inflation genie coming out of the bottle.
Yes, but Christine, you see the problem is that you don't create any jobs. You destroy jobs with your interference in economic growth.
With that positive initial statement, I would also like to add that it will not be without downside risks, and significant ones. With inflation running way below central bank targets in most corners, clearly we are seeing rising risk of deflation, which could prove disastrous for the recovery.
Yes, if that sounds like a bunch of gobbledygook, that's because it is. Because the IMF is, as later she'll refer to, Lord Keynes. I'm not even going to comment on that guy, but their belief is that there's not quite enough inflation now. Of course, that's kind of interesting if we look at the inflation that the little guy has to pay. He's being eaten alive, but Christine wants us to know that we have to have a little bit higher inflation because this genie of deflation might come out of the bottle, but also the genie of inflation. So, yeah, it doesn't make a lot of sense.
If inflation is the genie, then certainly deflation is the ogre. That must be fought decisively. During the years of crisis, we have relied heavily on the emerging market economies and on the low-income economies to actually be the drivers of growth. And if you combine those two categories, emerging and low-income countries, they produced actually about 3/4 of global growth. However, a growing number of those emerging market economies are slowing down as the economic cycle turns. So that's also one of the risks that we see going forward. We also see risks arising out of the financial market turbulence and the volatility of capital flows. The reaction to the Fed's tapering has been calm so far, and this is partly due to the fact that we had had a dry run back in May and June.
So the dry run was the talk that they were going to taper and the market started to crater. So again, they haven't really done any tapering, but that's different now because the markets haven't cratered. They were ready to prop up the markets with phony computer digitized printed money when they decided that they were going to think about tapering.
It is good news that this reaction was calm, but there could still be some rough waters ahead. Overall, as I said, the direction is positive, but global growth is still too low, too fragile, and too uneven. Moreover, even as it is, or as we forecast that it will be, it is not enough to create the 200 million jobs that are needed by people who are looking for a job everywhere in the world. Additionally, in too many countries, actually most countries, the benefits of growth are being enjoyed by far too few people. And just to give an example, in the United States, 95% of income gains since 2009 went to the top 1%.
Okay, so she's going to admit the fact that 99% of the money all went to the rich because of the central banks propping up the stock and bond markets, which the poor people don't participate in. And, of course, they consider inflation good, which is eating them up as they live day to day. But she's going to go ahead and praise the central banks, who are the exact culprits behind this. Makes a lot of sense.
95% of the income growth gains went to the top 1%. Now, this is not a recipe for stability and not a recipe for sustainability. Let's now turn to the policy recommendation. Because all of that really points to the fact that policymakers all need to stay focused. Focused on the policies that are needed for sustainable and inclusive growth, as well as rewarding jobs. We so far have certainly avoided the worst case scenario, and all policymakers have made part of the necessary efforts. Those that went clearly beyond, way beyond the call of duty, were the central bankers.
So what was the worst case scenario that we've avoided? It seems to me that we're right in the middle of the worst case scenario, which is she's already talked about the fact that all of the actions of the central bankers have resulted in the 1% gaining and the 99% losing. I don't know what she's referring to.
They did that to keep interest rates low, and the financial system functioning, while government, in most places, deployed fiscal stimulus where they could and applied adequate, sometimes a bit too much, fiscal consolidation where they should. The road has certainly been difficult and continues to be so, but as Edward Murrow once said, difficulty is the excuse that history never accepts. Now that the global economy looks more stable,
it does.
The big priority for policymakers from our point of view in 2014 is going to be to fortify the feeble global recovery and make it sustainable.
The one that you didn't predict?
Great. What does it mean in practice? I'm going to run you through the advanced economies that I will take by groups, then the emerging markets, then the low-income countries, as to what we see as a good coordinated policy mix that should be applied in order to secure and strengthen that growth and create those jobs. If we look at the advanced economies first, what it means is that, you remember what I said about the monetary policies applied by the central banks. Well, central banks are going to have to slightly, gradually, over time and properly communicated, undo what they have done. But they should not do that until growth is robust enough and firmly rooted. So the way in which tapering is applied, the way in which from unconventional to conventional they return, will have to be very well timed.
So we're going to get jobs when they stop printing the money that they printed to create jobs that didn't create any jobs.
At the same time, countries will need to use the room created by that unconventional policies to put in place the reforms that are needed to jumpstart growth and jobs.
And what are those reforms? More government spending!
So it's not just for central bankers to do some policy work, but it's also for the other players. in terms of budgetary policy in particular. Now let me go deeper and touch on the different regions and look first at the largest economic player in the world, the United States. Growth in the United States is certainly picking up, driven essentially by price.
Lies, driven by lies.
Demand. And that recovery that we have observed in 2013, that unfortunately was dragged by the fiscal consolidation of 2013, will be helped by the loosening of the fiscal corset as a result of the recent budget deal.
The loosening of the fiscal corset by the recent budget deal. So we need to spend more money.
Still, it will be critical to avoid premature withdrawal of monetary support and to return to an orderly budget process, including removing the threat of the debt ceiling.
So the danger is cutting government spending. That's how we're going to grow.
If we look now at the euro area,
okay, so I'm going to stop there. You can see that the IMF is a bunch of babbling idiots and morons that don't even know what they're talking about. We've seen the forecasts that they've been wrong forever and a day. They're always wrong. They didn't predict the financial crisis. They don't know what they're talking about. They are not even economists. And we can see with their reference to numerology, they're apparently a bunch of witches or something. I don't know. They probably would do better with a pot of frogs and newts or something like that, trying to predict global growth. But the main reason I think this is an important video is because they're hinting with the number 7 in the year 2014. Something's going to happen. Some big crisis is going to come out of somewhere. They seem to be hinting at cyber attacks. That's been the big theme lately. So the IMF has been wrong consistently. Of course, they're not held to account for their wrong forecast because the audience is filled with a bunch of press sycophants. If you watch it all the way through, you'll see the pre-staged questions just ridiculous and absurd. So these people are a complete joke. What they're saying doesn't even make any sense. They've never predicted anything accurately. They have absolutely no credibility whatsoever. They're a bunch of global vampires who live off the benefits that whatever economies have managed to escape their grasp and actually do some growing. They'll turn around and take credit for that growth, and they've pretty much destroyed Europe. They're in the process of destroying the United States and Japan. I guess they probably won't be satisfied until they've got their claws into every country in the world, and they've just pretty much destroyed the entire world. And we'll talk to you next time.